buy things and why? Well, in this episode, I am interacting with Professor Joseph Devlin, who is the Professor of Cognitive Neurosciences at the University College London. Well, let me introduce Joe to all of you. Joe started in artificial intelligence but found himself more interested in how the human mind works. After training in brain imaging at Cambridge and Oxford, he established a reputation as a leading researcher in how the human brain processes language before taking up posts as head of experimental psychology and then vice dean innovation and enterprise at UCL. Joe's research now focuses on how organizations can effectively use neuroscience to better understand consumer decision making, improve products and services, and enhance audience engagement. He has collaborated with various corporate partners include Audible, View Cinemas, Finecast, the rail industry, and Encore Tickets. His research has been featured in CNN, the BBC, and the Times, among others. Joe has published more than 80 scientific articles in international journals. So, let's delve into this fantastic conversation with Professor Joseph Devlin.
To everybody, and welcome to another interesting episode of The Different News. Today I have Professor Devlin Joseph with me, and we are going to talk about a very interesting subject altogether. I'm not sure if you have heard about consumer neuroscience or consumer behavior, but that's something which actually makes all of us become customers for different products, and that's how companies or people make us buy. So welcome Professor Joe, and thank you so much for being here on my podcast. It's a pleasure to have you today on my show and host you and learn so much from you about consumer neuroscience in particular.
I'm just so delighted to be here, Gargi. Thank you so much, and thanks for the invitation.
So Joe, the first question that I ask to all my guests, and my favorite question, is to learn about your career journey. I know a little bit of it, but I'm sure that my audience would be very interested to know from you. So please share your story with us.
Well, sure. My path has been a little bit of a windy one. I actually started out in artificial intelligence back in the 1990s, so like last century. And at the time, AI wasn't very sophisticated. It certainly was nothing like what we have now. And I actually got a little frustrated with the artificial side. I then moved into neuroscience, which was kind of booming with the discovery of these new types of brain scanners so that we could look inside, human brains as people were doing whatever kind of task, reading, writing, buying, whatever. And I got very fascinated with particularly language, how it is you and I can do this when our cousins, the chimps and gorillas, really can't, despite having very, very similar brains. And for 15, 20 years, I spent a lot of my time looking at the neuroscience of language. And at some point got a little frustrated with that too, thinking that it was very ivory tower. So it was interesting, but there weren't a whole lot of people around the world who were that engaged with it. So I thought I'd become more involved in some of the practical aspects of using psychology and neuroscience. And that's how I kind of got into consumer neuroscience. And for the last 10 years, I've been doing very much practical neuroscience as it relates to how do consumers make decisions, how do audiences respond to videos or stories or, creative of that port. And it's just keeps changing. And that's one of the things I love about a career in academia is you have that space to change directions. This is not what I thought I would be doing when I was 15, right?
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. I think You have a very versatile career, and generally, when we talk about the term career, we have a very streamlined thought process. Okay, I completely agree with you. What you say, that there should be something interesting what we do day in and day out, which makes our face lightened up every day when we get up in the morning. So I think your journey is fantastic. So a very basic question, maybe I would like to start with Joe, is what exactly is consumer neuroscience? If I just have to ask that simple question to you.
It's a simple question, but a complicated answer in some ways, because in some ways it's just a rebranding of neuromarketing.
Okay.
But the idea is basically that if you can apply the tools of neuroscience to try to understand how people behave and act, typically in a consumer scenario, then we can perhaps gain a little bit of extra insight into why people make the decisions they do, how they come to these decisions. And traditionally, you just ask people. Like market research spends a lot of time doing interviews or surveys. And of course, you ask people, well, why did you make these decisions? And they'll tell you, but they're not always right. And it's not that they're trying to be misleading. It's just that often we don't always know why we made, a particular decision. So the thinking is that starting with questions is a perfectly reasonable approach and that you can get a certain distance with that. But if you can get some additional information in terms of how their brain was actually functioning at the time of the decision, then maybe you can understand the process a little bit more deeply, even when we as consumers don't necessarily know why we did what we did.
Right, right. Thank you. I mean, as you said, it's a very, I know I made a very broad-based question, but it was very simple to understand what you say. I ask you how exactly brain science is applied to understand what we like or what we don't like when it comes to any purchase, our consumer behavior, basically.
Sure. So it was a nice example that we did with the company Audible, who make audiobooks.
Yeah.
Audible came to us and said, we'd like to understand whether or not listening to a story, as an audiobook versus watching it as a video or reading it as a book itself, does that change the way you experience the story? And that's actually a really interesting scientific question. Obviously, Audible were interested for more practical reasons. But that was a great little combination. So together with a colleague, I ran a study with Audible where we had people listening to scenes from 4 different books and then watching videos of scenes from 4 different books. And of course, if you cross it around so that some people saw the first set of books and the other group listened to the same book so that you can compare them, what you can do is you can ask people about their experience, and we do that. But in addition, for instance, we used basic sort of neuroscience tools like a smartwatch for measuring biometric signals. So things like heart rate and what's called the galvanic skin response, which is an index of sort of an emotional reactivity. And you can look at both sets of data in terms of how they respond. And what we found was that when you just ask people, they consistently preferred the videos. They said that they felt like they were more immersed in the story, they understood the point of view of the character better, they paid more attention, etc. But what was really interesting was if you looked at their physiological signals, you actually got the opposite story. They were working harder and more engaged when they were listening to the audiobooks than when they were watching the videos. And we think that this reflects the fact that, the audiobook kind of asks more of you. You have to be a co-creator. So there's the story coming in, but you're the person who's generating the scenes in your mind, the voices, the characters, as opposed to when we watch videos, a director and producer have already done that for us. So we can be a bit more passive. And what's really interesting is that you see this greater engagement in the audiobook that's very different from what people tell you in terms of their preferences, but it has a real implications for how well they remember the books and how engaged they feel with the books, which was a really nice example of how we can go beyond just what people simply say and try to get additional information about how their brain and their body react to these kind of things.
an amazing insight. I mean, that's an amazing example that you give. Yeah, honestly, we when surveys come, particularly even with myself, like I think for everybody of us, we just don't think so deeply. We give a surface answer probably because if the questions are little intriguing, maybe we think. But most of the time, we just click 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 and we just think when to end this survey now. Well, so when it comes to marketing, we have several market research methods, like I was talking about surveys, and sometimes we have polls or focus groups. So, how is consumer neuroscience different from traditional, marketing research methods? I should put it like that.
Well, I think the thing that makes it really different is going beyond that self-report. So even with things like focus groups, you're
Mm-hmm.
asking people to reflect on their own experience and then tell you about it,
Right.
which is great. You can get some real insights from that, but there are limits to it as well. So, for instance, you have what are called social desirability biases. So, for instance, I was sitting in on a focus group where they were asking people about packaging for vegetables, right? And we've all experienced packaging for vegetables, but I don't know about you. I hadn't really thought about it a whole lot. I don't know why onions come in a mesh and carrots come in a plastic bag. So when they ask these questions, people want to be helpful. They want to answer. And they're like, well, of course, onions, maybe they need more air or something. But honestly, it's not much about the consumer. It's about trying to be helpful and give you an answer, even if that answer really doesn't reflect anything I've ever thought about. So you have these kind of issues that come up with self-report. So the idea is that if you can go beyond just what's coming out of people's mouths and get an understanding of what's happening in their brain and their body, then maybe you can get this sort of extra information that can give you a less biased, a more unbiased answer to their own experience. And that's the main thinking behind consumer neuroscience. So it's not really intended to replace traditional marketing. It's intended to sort of enhance traditional marketing.
It's more like an adjunct, more like an additional tool, probably, if I can put that way. Yeah.
100%.
Yeah. So, when you say that we try to understand the brain science, right? So, is it true that it is more like a mind reading? Because some people might be skeptic when they come to know about this. What
Yeah,
is
I think that's a really
according to you?
big
Mhm.
topic.
Mhm.
And I think that a lot of the neuromarketing companies kind of pitch it in terms of mind reading. We can tell you what your consumers really think, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
Whereas in practice, I think that what we're normally looking for are things that we call biomarkers. So we want to find something in the data that signals a particular kind of reaction. So I'm not trying to read your mind, but I am trying to understand, like, how does your brain's reward system respond to this messaging? And if it responds more strongly, then you're probably going to have a better response to the message as a whole.
Mhm.
So what we really tend to be looking for are just individual markers in the biology rather than reading your mind as a whole. But, we get so much of that, and particularly with things like Neuralink, that Elon Musk project,
Absolutely. Mm.
you see this concern raised all the time. And I think it's a perfectly valid concern. It's
Mm.
just partly driven by the fact that it's marketed beyond what it is. We are claiming to do some mind reading when in fact what we're doing is something far more specific than that.
Correct, correct. I completely agree. And but do you think is there any ethical concern when it comes to this? I mean, because it's something where we are using brain data, trying to influence people, especially when they don't know, they don't realize what's happening. So, what would you
100%.
take on that? Yeah. Hmm.
Right. No, no, I think there's a great deal of ethical concerns here, and it requires a framework for trying to deal with them. But, for instance, there was an interesting study that one of my colleagues did a few years ago with eye tracking, which is a very basic tool about where your eyes are on the screen at any given point in time. And he did it in the context of moral decision making. So you'd see a question like, is it ever okay under any circumstance to kill another human being? And you could argue that one way or another, right? You could say, well, if I was defending a loved one,
Yeah.
there's no right or wrong. But what is on the screen is on the left and right is like yes and no. And what was fascinating was they tracked people's eyes. And if they simply made them make a decision when their eyes were on one side or the other, they were about 10% more likely to say wherever their eyes were, right?
Oh.
So they actually changed the decisions that people were making to these moral decisions based on information that the participant wouldn't be consciously aware of at all. You know where your eyes are, but you're not thinking that that somehow influences a basic decision. And of course, that kind of technology is very widely available. I mean, even my laptop has a camera that can do decent, not great, but decent eye tracking. And if I had an e-commerce site, there's no reason I couldn't be using that to do things like watch to see, oh, this is a product that's getting a little bit more interest. Maybe now's when I pop up the 10% discount and to try to influence people. And to me, that seems like an unethical use of this kind of biotech because you're using information that people are sharing unintentionally against them. And to me, that is the very definition of a non-ethical use of the data. There are lots of ethical uses, and particularly you see this in with behaviors that are designed to improve like public health or public finance and things. So the classic nudge, right, is that most of us are really bad at saving for retirement. So many companies nowadays, when you start working for them, by default, you're put into the retirement plan and a certain amount of your money from your check goes into your retirement plan, which is done for your benefit. It doesn't help the company at all. But people take the path of least resistance. It's harder to say no. And eventually, it'll help you. So that's like a really good use of a nudge in an ethical way. Bizarrely, you can use that same behavior unethically. So for instance, we all have these experiences on websites where you are asked to subscribe to something and you get the first week free, right? And after that, your credit card starts to be charged. Well, it's using the same behavior. We doing the path of least resistance. We think, sure, I'll get this week free and I'll cancel. But the reality is you're less likely to cancel because that's more work. And the company then just charges you away. And that, to me, is an unethical use of these kind of behaviors. So I think that the area is rife with both sides, and staying on the ethical light side is an important aspect that's really needs a lot of talking.
I agree. I agree. So Joe, just picking up one word when you were talking about data. So, for example, when we do any market research or any such thing, or probably subscriptions where we try to get leads, generally, supposedly we collect data in terms of name, email, or max to max phone number. So, if it is neuroscience, I mean, when it comes to consumer neuroscience studies, what kind of personal data are collected and who has access to this information?
Right. It depends a little bit on who's doing the study. So in academia, like, at a university, anywhere across the world, we normally do it with informed consent. So we tell participants exactly what data we're collecting, how long it'll be in use for, and who can access it. And normally who can access it is the research team doing the study, the professor and their graduate students or whoever. So I think that tends to be very strictly regulated and very tightly controlled ethically. Outside of academia, there are less strict controls, and it becomes a little bit less clear. So even with just cameras, which are very, very cheap these days, a lot of billboards now have cameras in them that I don't think a lot of consumers are aware of. So the cameras are there to keep track of the people walking by, whether you're looking at it or not. Are you male or female? Are you from this group or that group? All of that data can be collected and used to change the content on the screen. So in London, there's an airport called City Airport where they were doing this with this one billboard. and they would just basically change the ads depending on whether they were mostly men or mostly women in front of it. And they would send you to different places in the airport. And
That's
you
very interesting. I've never imagined or never heard of it. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, yeah, please continue. Yeah.
And you can imagine that, like, you could have different opinions about this. So I've talked to some people who said, "Oh, that's great. I'd rather be sent to the stores that would be potentially most useful to me." And I've
Right.
had other people say, "No, that's really creepy. And how do they know what I want? I don't need that kind of manipulation."
Hmm.
And I think that there are reasonable perspectives. I personally tend to fall on I think that's a bit creepy. So I think that organizations outside of academia should follow a similar sort of guideline principles to those that we use in sort of ethics. But that's my own opinion, and I'm an academic.
True, true. Yeah, because sometimes it might not be good, or like I think it's a very debatable area to talk about. It absolutely depends on the perspective. Because when you shared, I got a little excited because I thought, oh, that's great. I mean, if if they are showing me what I want to see, then makes my life easier, and I just go and buy or drop to that counter, whatever. So I think it's absolutely based on personal perspective, and I think any good technology used in the good way is, I think, always for betterment. That's how I perceive technology in modern time today. What tools we are having in terms of AI or any other advancements that we have in terms of being misused, particularly, maybe taking this example. This is not a very correct example for the question what I'm asking, but I'm trying to understand, say, for children, for people who have mental health issues. Can these tools be misused, or I mean, how is that part?
For certain, right? I mean, it's very easy to use these tools for what I would consider unethical purposes, and even easier if it's a vulnerable group like children or people with mental health concerns. And you see this, right? So I'll give you two examples. One, there are reports out of China. I have not been able to verify these, that there are some schools in China that are asking children to wear these EEG headbands as part of their school uniforms so that it measures sort of brainwave activity so they can monitor their focus in school. And I think this is really deeply worrying. For one, the kids don't really have any choice, obviously. And there's very personal data, including medical data, that are being recorded, and it's not exactly clear how it's being used. It's also not clear whether or not the science is really valid here, right? I mean, is it equally true that every kid is going to have the same signs of focus? And if not, are you possibly discriminating against subgroups, just not intentionally, but nonetheless discriminating against them? So that's the kind of thing that worries me. But you also see this with mental health products. There's a lot of what I call neurobolics out there, which is people who are sort of neuro-washing a product. And you see it with certain types of mental health drugs. Well, they'll say, oh, it's not a drug, but it's a supplement. And if you suffer from depression or anxiety, or you suffer from OCD, or whatever the case may be, taking this supplement that'll boost your brain power and enhance alpha wave power or something, they normally like toss it up in neuroscience terms. Well, at best, it doesn't help you at all, other than you're losing money. But at worst, it could be detrimental, right? There's no guarantees because these aren't very well regulated.
Right.
And you see that with neurostimulation products of various sorts, with neuroptic drugs, supplements. And I think that they particularly prey on people who are potentially vulnerable to this because they're looking for solutions because they've got a real problem that they need to work
Right.
on. And if they don't feel that the traditional medical community is being sufficiently helpful, then they'll
Hmm.
look for something else. And that's completely understandable, but it puts them at risk.
Correct.
Which is sad.
Yeah, that's sad. That really sad. We talked about misuse, ethics, and all. So, any guidelines are there that researchers could follow or companies could follow while using neuroscience for their benefit in marketing?
So for me, I definitely think there are, and I actually call them values because I use the acronym, right? So literally the V is for voluntary. People have to be providing informed consent. They have to know what they're agreeing to participate in. A is for autonomous. So you can't be manipulating that. You have to respect the fact that people have the right to make their own choices and decisions. Obviously, we're influenced all the time by things, but there's a line between influence and manipulation. You have to respect autonomy. It has to be limited, L. So the data can't have to be used for a specific purpose and stored safely and only available to the people that are involved and not shared more widely or sold on. U is for understood, that participants have to be giving informed consent. They have to really understand what they're saying yes to. And I think that's tricky, particularly with some of this neuroscience, which can be complicated. E is for equitable. A lot of the data can potentially discriminate, even if it's not intentional. And it's really important that as the marketers, as the researchers, we are confident that our procedures are not discriminating. They're applying equally across the board. And then S is finally for scientific. Like, it has to be real science. If you're just giving pseudoscience or hokey, then you're exploiting people. And I think that if you maintain all of those values, you are very firmly on the side of ethical work that potentially can benefit the consumer and your organization, which is where we all want to be.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing this valuable value. So I'll come a little bit to healthcare marketing because that's the domain I belong from. Because here in healthcare, we have a lot of areas where emotions and decision making are quite sensitive,
Yes.
many a times. So how can brain-based insight help us without crossing our ethical boundaries and do good marketing when it comes to healthcare businesses?
I think there are a couple of opportunities here. One is trying to understand those emotions better. I mean, emotions are a classic case where it's very difficult for people to self-report in a meaningful way, partly because you and I may experience something very similar, but report it very differently.
Right.
And that's just because there are cultural differences, there are gender society differences, and then there are just individual differences in the way people do these kind of things. So if you could add some neuroscience to measure sort of the strength of the emotional reaction, as well as sort of simple things like whether it's more positive or more negative, then I think you can start to see more clear signal, more similarity across your patient population that would be very difficult to get just out of self-report. And the other thing, I mean, the one thing that I really love about the pharma industry is they're very, very evidence-based. They understand the importance of legitimate, good quality evidence. And marketing, as a rule, is less evidence-based. It's a little bit more intuitive. But some of the consumer neuroscience developments are around, well, how do audiences respond to your marketing materials, your videos, your stills, whatever it is you're doing, your packaging. And I think that offers some real potential, particularly for groups, clients like pharma, who care about evidence, who want to say, no, show me the data that this is actually a better approach than this other one. I think that that's hard to do in traditional marketing. But the addition of consumer neuroscience gives you a few tools for trying to provide that evidence base that certain clients, like particularly in the healthcare field, might really care for.
Right, right. Thank you, Joe. Thank you for answering that. When it comes to trust, building trust, this is very important when it comes to science businesses, healthcare businesses. How effectively can we engage our audience? Of course, being in the ethical boundary, using the power of neuroscience.
Well, one of the things that my colleague Daniel Richardson and I have been working on for several years is trying to measure that engagement because it's not always easy. A lot of the current market is is based on the attention economy, where basically what they're doing is looking to see whether your eyes are on the messaging. And that's great. And there's some real value to that. But just the fact that your eyes are on the screen or something doesn't tell you how much of an emotional reaction they're getting, how well they're going to remember it. There's a whole deeper set of cognitive processes. And one of the things that we've looked at is something that we call neurological synchrony. So that is to say, how similar are our brains responding to these messages? And what's remarkable is that you can get decent data from these little biometric watches, your smartwatch, your Fitbit, that tells you a little bit about your emotional reaction in terms of something called your sympathetic nervous system, which you can just measure at the wrist, which is crazy. But so simplifying a lot of the brain data in terms of, well, second by second, how is your emotional reactivity going up and down? And is it more or less similar across an audience? And the more similar it is, that means that we're more engaged with the same messaging. So if we're watching the same video, there's a plot line and it's going up and we're both doing that with our heart rates. Whereas if we're watching this video and I'm thinking about the mortgage and the kids, my heart rate's kind of going off into its own little place. And therefore there's less synchrony. So we find these kind of measures that can tell you, okay, well, in this group, in this audience, how is it responding to this material? And of course, that kind of information is potentially useful for optimizing your messaging. It's potentially beneficial for deciding the media plan for it. So if, I have a couple of things that I've put together and some of them work really well with Gen Z and some of them are more Gen X, well, then of course I'm going to put my Gen Z on socials and I'll put my Gen X in TV or something. And you'll know far more about the actual marketing side of that than I do. But I think that the kind of additional information that quantifies how audiences respond to your communications, your marketing, your advertising is a real potential benefit.
I mean, that's amazing. I mean, because I think this field is a very ongoing and growing field. And I think as time goes, and I feel more people need to be trained in this aspect because I think this is a very niche field. I haven't heard much before, and when it comes to healthcare and science businesses, it's always exciting for me. But when we get this kind of insights, it helps to do things in a much better way in terms of being a company or providing our services or products. Second, I also feel that if we have these kind of insights together, we also are giving the right thing to the right people and at the right time. So of course, keeping the ethical boundaries, like you mentioned. So I think it's an amazing area that we are talking about. Well, Joe, in this era of AI, like you started AI when probably we never heard about it or nobody talked about it. But then today everybody talks about AI, whether we understand or not, but we know what is AI. So in this era, without a question on AI, I mean, that's not justice. So my question is that now with AI, we can analyze the brain data. So again, this the ethical risk or those kind of opportunities combining AI with consumer neuroscience, do you see any potential risks to it, or how do you perceive it? Maybe I am I'm very concerned about the data, the ethics, because that's something which runs back in the mind always.
No, I think that you're right to be concerned about those things because there have been very high profile examples of kind of misuses. So for instance, I can't remember whether it was Apple, but it was one of those companies started a new credit card. And what they were doing was they were using AI to make credit line decisions, like should you get a credit card, and if so, what kind of credit line you should have. And they were doing it with one of the big major banks. But what was really interesting is they were using a lot of your analytics, online data, and then some of the biometrics that they have from people who wear smartwatches and other things. And they were routinely giving men much, much higher credit limits than women, even when that was vastly inappropriate. So there was one person who is an actor called this out, and he said, "Well, my wife and I both did this, and I got a credit limit of, I don't know, 10,000, and hers is 1,000, and she earns 1,000 times more than me." Right? She she's a really superstar actress. How could this be possible? And it turns out that, a lot of the data that's used to train some of these big AI models have these implicit biases in them because they're in society, they're in a lot of the data that exists. And as a result, you end up with these situations that can be deeply unfair and discriminatory towards groups. Not, and I'm sure that they didn't intend to. That wasn't, that wasn't the point. It was intention or not, it's still there. And that's a real worry. On the plus side, there are, like I use MRI brain scanners at work, and these things are, like 3 million pounds, and they weigh 2 tons, and they're not handy kind of devices for every person. And you need that in order to get good brain scans out of it. But recently, there's a company that's produced a 200, like it weighs 200 kilos instead of 1,000 kilos, and is portable, which means if you put it on wheels, you can move it around. But and what they've done with that is they've used AI to enhance the signal that they can get out of the brain scan. And now all of a sudden they have this brain scanners that you can kind of wheel around in a hospital to like hospital beds. So normally you would take patients to the big MRI scanner, and some patients you can't because of the equipment that they have. Whereas now there's this portable scanner that makes use of AI that may not be as wonderful as the, 3 billion pound machine, but if it's much more accessible and much more usable for people, then I think that there's a real benefit to that. So there's pros and cons to AI and neuroscience, just like everything. And I like to try to focus on the positives where they're available. But you're absolutely right to be worried about the others.
Yeah, but yeah, I mean, with any change, there is always a positive or negative. But I think technology, I always feel that the faster we adapt and try to, put it into the right way, it will always enhance quality of life. It will always enhance the societal health. That's how I perceive technology myself. So Joe, coming almost to the concluding part of our conversation, it's going very interesting. I mean, I can talk with you, I think, the whole day, but that would not be a good idea for the audience. So,
Not fair.
Yeah. So, looking ahead, if I give you a timeline of say 5 to 10 years from now, where do you see consumer neuroscience going?
I think it'll become increasingly mainstream. I think that your point just then about the technology being adopted and being used more productively and less nonsense is very much in that 5 to 10 year window. Part of that's just simply that the tools have become so much more widespread. So with people wearing biometric watches now, when Google bought Fitbit, they spent, I think it was $3 billion or something. They didn't do that because that's how much people spend on Fitbits. They did that because that is an immense second-by-second database about physiology of people who are interacting with online products and Google services. So, the tools have become widespread. The cameras that exist on our devices, our phones, just CCTV, are increasingly widespread. So the opportunity to collect these data, for good or for bad, is just going up and up and up at an unbelievable rate. And I think organizations realize with that comes opportunity. Whether or not they try to use it for purely commercial, we're going to exploit people, or whether they try to use it in a productive, ethical way where they're thinking, look, we can improve our products and services so that it matches better our consumer needs, so that there's a win-win. that's going to vary depending on the organization and the people involved. But it's just becoming inevitable in much the way that AI is. And I think it will completely shape the consumer experience within the next decade.
Thank you, Joe. It was such an interesting conversation with you. And before you go, any last message that you would like to give to people?
Well, I think I'd love to pick up on one of the things you said, which is that it's incredibly niche, and I think that we do need more and more people being aware and getting training and getting expertise in this, and I think that will definitely happen naturally. But I certainly love to encourage any young person who's thinking that this is a topic that's interesting to explore it. There are opportunities all around the world to get involved, either commercially or academically, or both. And I think that you won't be sorry that you've done that, just because it's so much the rising future that there's a lot of opportunity here to do amazingly good win-win kind of work.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you so much for being here. And it was fantastic talking with you. And I hope we will have more conversations in the near future, learning more about your work particularly, because today I think we had a very general, touch and go kind of a conversation. But I think in the coming days, I would love to reconnect and bring such more episodes with you where we talk about your work in depth.
Well, thank you very much. I really enjoyed chatting with you, and hopefully your listeners get to some new information too.
Absolutely, absolutely. So thank you everybody for joining in this episode, and I hope you enjoyed, and please subscribe my channel and keep watching the different news.